Research Unit webinar series. I'd like to welcome everybody to this iteration of the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit's webinars. Today, we are talking about the population impact of e-cigarettes in Canada, a simulation model. My name is Rob Schwartz. I am the Executive Director of the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit, and it's my pleasure today to be moderating this session. So I'm going to do some introductions, then we're going to hear from two speakers, and there will be lots of opportunity for Q&A. Today, we are also, as always, making mention of the lands upon which we sit. And the acknowledgement that I'm giving is the acknowledgement for people who are at the University of Toronto downtown campus at St. George. As I do this land acknowledgement, I always think about other lands upon which I've settled in the past. And I know that there are people with us from different places in Canada and maybe outside of Canada as well. And you will all have different lands and different Indigenous communities in mind as we do acknowledge the land. So I wish to acknowledge a land upon which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, it is the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Let's just a moment to absorb that. Before I introduce the speakers, as you can tell, you are all muted and your videos have been shut off. This is sort of just the webinar style of doing these things. It's not that we don't want interaction. We do want interaction, and you're very much encouraged to ask questions, make comments in the chat as we go along. With that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Anasua Kundu is a PhD student at University of Toronto in the Institute of Medical Science. She's been working with the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit now for 2 years, mainly on projects related to vaping behavior and to smoking cessation. She's also had some focus on mental health and substance use, and a focus on LGBTQ2S+ communities. Dr. Michael Chaiton is not a stranger to most of you. Michael is the Director of Research at the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit. He's an Associate Professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at University of Toronto, and he's a scientist at CAMH. Michael has been leading CIHR-funded research, and I will mention other funded research also at the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit into tobacco availability since 2010. Michael is my close colleague and the lead or co-lead on many of our projects. He is the brains behind and also the initiator of this project on modeling. And just by way of introduction, this webinar covers ground which has been many of us have been wondering about for a long time. And the answers to the questions that are posed here really should inform the lively debate, I will say, in the tobacco control community and outside of it about the benefits versus the harms of e-cigarettes, as opposed to the benefits versus the harms of cigarettes. I'm going to ask Anasua now at this point to take it away, and you can share your slides and do your presentation.
Thanks, Rob. Let me share my screen first.
Yeah, go ahead. We can see your slides.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. So hello everyone. Today I'm going to present the findings of Canadian e-cigarette proportional multi-state light table model. And first I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and rationale behind the study. Then I'll explain the method and present the results. After finishing my presentation, Dr. Michael Chaiton will present different simulation scenarios and their findings. So e-cigarette or vaping products came into the market as a smoking cessation aid in the early 2000s. And since then, it has become increasingly popular, particularly among the young population. This is the findings from the Commonwealth 2020 International Health Policy Survey. The survey was conducted in 11 countries, and they found that on average, 4% of the adults use vaping products some day of every day of their life. And this percentage was 5% among the Canadians. And also compared to only 3% of the people with 35 years or older, about 11% of the Canadians 18 to 34 years age use these vaping products some day or every day of their life. This is the Canadian Tobacco and Nicotine Survey 2019 data showing past 30-day vaping prevalence. And again, you can see that compared to 15% of the adolescents and 15% of the young adults, only 2.9% of the adults 25 and older reported using vaping products in the past 30 days. So there are still lots to be done in terms of vaping related research, but using vaping products has both harms and benefits, and which differs between different age groups. Like clearly the vaping is beneficial for adult regular smokers. It acts as a smoking cessation aid and reduces harm when it completely substitutes combustible cigarette use. But at the same time, it is harmful for adolescents, youth, and pregnant women. It can lead to nicotine dependence, and it can also lead to initiation of combustible cigarette use among young non-smokers. Several new generation e-cigarette products like Fuse 5 or Juul contain nicotine at high nicotine concentration, like 60 milligram per ml, which leads to increase in the blood nicotine level significantly. In addition to nicotine, there are also some harmful carcinogenic chemicals and toxic solvents in the e-liquids. Moreover, researchers also found that using e-cigarette products are associated with increased heart rate, oxidative stress. It can exacerbate the symptoms of chronic lung patients and also increases the risk of developing COPD and lung cancer. And again, still the long-term health impacts of vaping is still unknown. Regarding the e-cigarette policies and regulations, different countries have adopted different policies to regulate e-cigarette products. Some have taken extreme regulatory measures like e-cigarette sale, possession, and use of vaping products is banned in Thailand. While in Australia, the sale of commercial products are banned, but they allow the prescription of vaping products or e-cigarette. The vaping products sale was banned in New Zealand until February 2021, and after that it was completely withdrawn. Compared to them, in the UK, sale of e-cigarette are allowed both as a consumer product and as medicinal product, but they limited the concentration of nicotine in their e-liquid to less than or equal 20 milligram per ml. Compared to UK, the US and Canada has taken more precautionary approach. Vaping product first entered Canadian market in 2004, and in 2018, the sale of nicotine-containing vaping products was made legal in Canada. The US has recently raised the legal age to purchase vaping products to 21, but recent data shows that compared to the US and Canada, e-cigarette use is not rising in the UK. So it suggests that regulatory approaches probably are working there. Campus et al. Presented the simplified spectrum of e-cigarette regulation and incentivization, which ranges from health protection to health reduction, and presents different approaches of regulation. Health protection mainly targets the younger age group, while harm reduction mainly targets the adult smoker group. And both prohibition and legalization has their pros and cons. Prohibition mainly delivers clear public health message that e-cigarette is harmful. At the same time, it blocks access to e-cigarette as for smoking cessation. So it encourages people to buy e-cigarettes from illegal sources. In contrast, legalization. Yeah.
Can I just stop you for a sec? Sorry for interrupting.
Okay.
Would you be able just to slow down a little bit?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So legalization supports harm reduction, and it targets mainly current smokers. And at the same time, it increases access to e-cigarette among the young population. So it exposes them to the long-term health impacts of vaping and harmful effects too. So it is important to simulate the impact of e-cigarette use on the health system. So in the recent years, several simulation models was completed across the world, but mostly in the US. The Soneji et al. Conducted a simulation model, and they examined the impact of e-cigarette use for smoking cessation among current smokers and smoking initiation among never smokers. And they found that even at the, if we assume that 95% harm reduction is done by vaping compared to smoking, they found that significant lives were lost. And this loss was worsened with a reduction in the harm reduction percentage. Another study in the US found that impact of e-cigarette use for smoking cessation resulted in reduction in the smoking prevalence, which was greater than the effect on smoking, effect on impact of e-cigarette use on smoking initiation. Levy et al. Presented a smoking and vaping model in recent years, which presented that if the current trends of vaping use is continued in the US, it will lead to significant life save between 2013 and 2016. Another Monte Carlo analysis was done on US and the UK data, Kalpuran and Lange, and it showed that if e-cigarette is only used for smoking cessation purpose and no initiation was found, no smoking initiation is found among the young users, then it will lead to significant health benefits. And the Petrovic-Van der Dien et al. Model was done on the New Zealand data, and they measured the cost effectiveness of legalization of e-cigarette on a completely restrictive environment, and they found significant health benefits and cost savings. So here comes our present study, because no simulation model is yet done on the Canadian context on the e-cigarette use or its impact on the health system. So the objective of our present study was to assess the healthcare system cost savings and quality adjusted life years, QALYs, gained due to the liberalization of the e-cigarette market in Canada. We mainly adopted the Petrovic-Van der Dien et al. Tobacco multi-state life table model in our study. The baseline business as usual scenario in our study was a Canadian population who were alive in 2019, and we simulated them until date or age 110 years. The intervention scenario in our model simulated impact of liberalization through transition between 6 different use status. For example, transition from never smoker to current smoker, or exclusive vapor, or dual user. We populated the multi-state life table model with population inputs, 70 tobacco-related disease-specific inputs, and healthcare cost data. The 17 tobacco-related disease included coronary heart disease, stroke, COPD, lower respiratory tract infection, and 13 cancers. In our model, we used the relative health risk of vaping was 33% compared to smoking. And this percentage was taken from a recent article of Wilson et al. And finally, the Monte Carlo simulation was run in Excel by using a search for 1,000 runs and 44 iterations in each run. So these are the population and disease specific inputs that we used in our model and their data sources. The population estimates are taken from the Statistics Canada 2019 data, and the total mortality rates was also taken from the Statistics Canada 2018 data. Total years of life lost and disease-specific parameters are mainly taken from the Global Burden of Disease data 2017, but some of the disease-specific parameters are also taken from Canadian Chronic Disease Surveillance System 2016 and Statistics Canada 2015 to 2017 data. For the health system cost, we used the New Zealand data from the Petrofish Pendleton et al. Model, and we converted the New Zealand dollar into Canadian dollar to get the Canadian estimates. And all the disease parameters are inputted into the multi-state life table model by 5-year age group and sex. Following the data input, we did the data extrapolation. So the goal of the data extrapolation was to forecast the older age group data for each parameter. So to do it, we mainly created the trend lines based on the younger age group data and to forecast the older age group data. And the best fitting trend line was determined by choosing the smallest error estimated between the observed and the predicted data. After that, we did the DISMOD2 processing of the data. So all 17 disease parameters are inputted into the DISMOD2 to generate an epidemiologically coherent set of parameters. For example, like if for a given disease, the prevalence was too low compared to the incidence or the mortality rate, then the DISMOD2 will process the data to form an outcome value that is more epidemiologically consistent. So 3 disease parameters are inputted into the DISMOD2: incidence, prevalence, and mortality. And all parameters underwent a pairwise linear interpolation and are smooth using a moving average. So after the processing, we got 7 disease parameters. And then the simulation model was run using a search. These are the output after the DISMOD2 processing for ischemic heart disease. And now comes the result. So our simulation model, we found that if we assume that the relative risk of vaping is 33% that of smoking, then compared to a restrictive regulatory environment, the liberalization of vaping product market would result in a total loss of 233,300 QALYs and 7 billion Canadian dollar excessive cost. Overall, per capita, 63 QALYs would be lost, and Canadian dollar 1,891 excessive cost would be needed. These are the results of QALYs lost and cost offsets for different age groups and sex, and their 95% uncertainty interval. So from these results, we found that the net health loss and excessive cost are higher among female compared to the male, and over 60% of the net health loss and excessive cost was among the 45 to 64 years age group, which might be due to the cumulative health harms which might be occurred among the dual users. And there was a slight benefit of QALY gain and cost savings among the 15 to 24 years age group, but this may be due to the avoidance of health harm of smoking among the e-cigarette users who might have started smoking in a more restrictive environment. But the 95% uncertainty interval for this age group included the null value, so the effect is uncertain. Overall, the 95% uncertainty interval for all age groups except 65 years or older lie within 0. So it suggests that there is low confidence in the direction of the effect. So now our results was consistent with Soneji et al. And Kalkoran and Glanch model. So where if we assume that the relatively high relative risk of vaping compared to smoking, then it results in higher loss of QALYs and cost excess. We particularly in our model, we didn't find any harm reduction effect among the older age group, And but one finding that was important, that the smoking initiation among never smokers might increase the prevalence of dual users and also the current vapors, which might lead to the increase in the health loss and cost essays among 45 to 64 years age group. So our conclusion was liberalization of the vaporized nicotine products compared to a restrictive regulatory environment could result in net health harms and increased cost under the assumption that relative risk of vaping is 33% that of smoking. But we have to keep in mind that the long-term health effects of vaping is still not fully known. With the change in the relative risk, the outcome also changes, which after finishing my presentation, Dr. Michael Chaiton is going to elaborate the findings. And so future research should explore the long-term health effects of vaping. Also, access to the limiting access to the younger age group can also change the result. So future research should explore this possibility, and policymakers should consider calibrating different approaches to get the intended results. Thanks. And now Dr. Michael Chaiton will present his presentation. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Anasua. That was a lot of information in a short period of time. The important thing, I think, for us to note right now is the results, that at a 33% assumption of relative risk of e-cigarettes versus smoking, there is a net loss in terms of qualities and in terms of healthcare costs. There's some uncertainty, as I understand, about these findings, but that is the direction of the findings. There's lots of questions here. I've got a few, and there have been a few in the chat. We're going to hold our fire just a little bit more while Michael presents some other scenarios and maybe explains a bit of, we'll be able to answer some of the questions that some of us already have in our heads and have posted in the chat. So Michael's already got a very cool slide up, and I'm going to hand it over to him. Go ahead, Michael.
Hey, thanks, Rob, and thanks, Anasua, for presenting the main scenario that came out of our simulation model. I'd like to just reiterate that we based this strongly on the Petrovic Van Dien model, and we worked with her group along with Tony Blakely and Nick Wilson and others who were instrumental in developing this model based on the Bodhi 3, it's called, simulation. So we just make sure we give them sufficient credit for really doing the hard work here. The simulation models are based off of our assumptions. They're one of the main benefits is that they allow us to test those assumptions and see how they play out, and the uncertainty involved in what happens when we change those assumptions. So there were some comments around did we look at different rates and different impacts, and the answer is there's a lot of parameters that go in this model, and we're looking at them all essentially. We are trying to look at the impacts of what happens when you change those parameters, and as we put in the Canadian population trends, both in prevalence and in health diseases, that some of those is incorporated, and we'll see how that might play out, for instance, compared to the Americans a little bit later. But the important thing here is that simulation models do allow us to test assumptions and see what those impacts might be. And obviously, one of our key assumptions is over the relative risk of vaping. So we used, as for the main analysis, we took Nick Wilson and others' paper, which did a systematic review of essentially the relative toxicants that are been observed in e-cigarettes compared to that of cigarettes, and they applied a strategy to apply them to different diseases. So these are the ones, this is, and with different relative harms for different sets of diseases. And this averages out on a population level to approximately a 33% overall relative use of vaping products versus smoking. I think, though, it's really important to note that these are still estimates. It is possible that this estimate of 33% is much too high. We can't say that for certain, and it's also possible that some of this is too low. And even more likely that there's more variation here than would be expected. I mean, my own personal interpretation would suggest that things like diabetes, which is classified into cardiac disease category here, animal models suggest that diabetes is driven by nicotine alone in terms of the relationship, whereas some cancers are maybe more associated with toxicants, and maybe some of the cancers like the oral or lung cancers that have more direct exposure might be different than other types of cancers, but here they're just classified in one category. And finally, there might be things around COPD and other respiratory effects where we may be underestimating the impact of e-cigarettes, that the damage may be partially caused by the physical nature of the particles themselves, and the microparticles associated with vaping may be, again, differently or even more damaging than the larger particles in cigarettes. But we don't know. And so this is a way of being able to put our guesses on the table and to see what the impact of those assumptions can be. So we looked at different levels of relative risk for the overall impact. So we kept all of the other parameters the same, and we just changed the relative risk, and it follows a pretty smooth continuum here, with the exception of the 33%, which is because it's a little bit more varied rather than across the board shift. And what's important to note here is that, indeed, if we do take a safer estimate of e-cigarettes, if we use the Public Health England estimate of a 95% safer or a 5% relative risk, using all the same assumptions in this model, there's a clear net and large benefit to our current policy model and current policies around e-cigarette, a quality adjusted life year savings of about 1.5 million life years over the course of the 100-year simulation that's used in this model. So that's a big impact. Conversely, though, if we follow the trend lines down, we assume that e-cigarettes are closer to the harms of cigarettes themselves. We can see that it reaches down at a 95% as harmful as cigarettes, could suggest that the impact of e-cigarettes would be a cost of over 3.5 million life years saved. So if, depending on whether you're very optimistic or very pessimistic about the relative assessment of e-cigarettes, that's a huge range of potential impact for our current policy environment. In this model, at our baseline assumptions, the risks, the benefits grow into costs, crosses the line at around 30% relative risk, with our 33% slightly higher than that. The other estimate of relative risk, of course, is the impact on dual use. And I think this is a question that really hasn't been addressed very well at all. And about how much, if any, risk reduction will be seen. I think there is an argument that as people are continued smoking, and this is independent of the effect of e-cigarettes on quitting smoking, but it's lifetime dual use. Would you see any risk reduction at all? And it's likely that there would be some, but probably that effect would be smaller. Our base model used an estimate of about 15%, which was actually larger than that used in the Petrovic Van Dien model, which used an 8% as their main scenario. And you can see here that this again crosses the risk-benefit line. It goes in the opposite direction, of course, but crosses the risk-benefit line at around 35%. So that's assuming continued smoking, and again, it's likely that there would be some minimal impact of dual use on itself, but certainly that is up for debate. And there are people who do see that there's a potential for dual use on its own to have, because there may be different ways that they cause disease, may be actually worse than and not have any reduction at all. But I think when we look at these results around relative risk, I think to me this gives some insight into the debate and the vociferousness of the debate that we're having. That ultimately this is a debate about assumptions. We're not going to be here for 100 years to be able to see how this plays out. And that it may take that long. I mean, after all, we have been studying the harms of cigarettes for over 100 years, and we're still finding additional harms. We're still understanding more about how cigarettes cause disease. And certainly over the past decade or so that e-cigarettes have been available, is really early in the process to be certain about the absolute level of risk. But these assumptions matter, even though we don't know the answers. And so if we think about what someone believes on the base level of the relative risk. So if you think that along this continuum, that the relative risk of e-cigarettes is less than 20% that of cigarettes, like 5% or so, then what we're doing with e-cigarettes right now is fantastic. We're saving over the course of the next century a huge number of life years. And anything that we do that limits or restricts that policy is ultimately costing lives from our existing baseline. On the other hand, if you're more in this middle group, that you think that the relative risk of e-cigarettes is around 30% of cigarettes, then what we're in is an area of uncertainty, that the current policy is probably poor. But that tweaks to this policy are probably sufficient to, at minimum, make e-cigarettes a clear net benefit. Finally, if you think that the relative risk of e-cigarettes is more than 40% that of cigarettes, then what we're doing with our current policy is actually disastrous, that we may be causing millions of extra years of life lost, causing tremendous burden to the health system, and that we need major changes to our current policy levels in order to rectify this. So looking at overall, depending on what you believe about a number of relativity that is uncertain, will determine drastically your perception of the current situation and what needs to be done about it in completely opposite and opposing ways. And it's no surprise then that we have this vociferous debate that is based off of different levels of assumption of risk, where there are, I think, where there are many unknowns and where we have much study to be able to do that further. I think it's also notable, and it's important to note that our findings here are different from the Levy model that appeared in 2021. And they looked at a couple of different levels of e-cigarette risks as themselves. And at both 5% and 40% risks, that they found that in the US population that e-cigarettes were a net benefit. Now, there are a multitude of different differences between the Levy model and ours. There are really host. It's sort of a fundamental differences in how you think about population frameworks, and the actual populations are different and they have different time frames. But one thing I wanted to sort of call out is the difference in the way that transition probabilities are framed in each of these studies. That the one we use here is a little bit more complex. Essentially, you can see the Petrovic-Van Dien model on the left and the Levy model on the right that essentially shows the same aspects of this. What this model does is essentially divides non-smokers into two groups for the e-cigarette model. And looking at the probability of those who would have become smokers in the absence of e-cigarettes and those who would have remained non-smokers in the absence of e-cigarettes. And then applying different probabilities of trying and quitting and continued use to and applying that to the population. The Levy model, by contrast, has different ways of framing the age, but fundamentally looks at switching as the basis here, rather than and doesn't have this sort of counterfactual approach to what would have happened under the previous scenario. And if we turn to e-cigarette onset, we can see that this counterfactual actually makes a big difference. Comparing those who would have been cigarette smokers to those who have been non-smokers without e-cigarettes, it's really important important effects. So this is a little bit complicated in terms of conceptually. But this presents sort of three different scenarios. Our main scenario that we did here. The second bar is we're raising the onset level. So we're increasing the rate of cigarette use among those who would be non-smokers. So they would have been non-smokers without e-cigarettes. And we're raising the rate of vaping among that group. And what we can see is that under that scenario, we have more than about a doubling of the health costs associated with that. On the other side, if we lower, so that is we lower, not raise, but lower the onset of vaping among those who would be smokers, then what we see is a dramatically worse impact among this population. So reducing the onset of vaping among those who would be smokers is also a way of increasing net harm. And so we can also think about this conversely. The way that we need to create benefits would be to raise the level of onset among those who would have been smokers, and lower it among those who would have been non-smokers. So it's obviously very difficult to, we can simulate this, but it's very difficult to identify what somebody might have done in the future. And so this makes any scenario and any policy implications very challenging. The second aspect to e-cigarette onset is it also does depend on risk level as well, our assumption around risk level. So in here, we just did an across the board lowering of cigarette onset, so not divided by whether or not it would be non-smokers or would be, but just a direct cut of half of e-cigarette onset. And here what we see overall is that we would give overall benefits. That because most people would have not been non-smokers, that we end up with over 300,000 additional lives saved compared to the main analysis. And what was previously at this 33% risk level, a net cost is a net benefit, albeit a small one, and certainly within the uncertainty range. However, for those who are more optimistic about the relative risks about e-cigarettes, and here we're doing an extreme one to sort of demonstrate this more clearly, a true sort of e-cigarette idealist, where you see almost no harm associated with e-cigarettes themselves and substantial benefits of dual use. What happens if you lower onset across the board like this? Instead of the net gain that you see in our main scenario, under 33% relative risk, what you see is a lowering, a cost, an additional loss of over 300,000 quality adjusted life years saved. So that there, again, here is a complication driven by our assumptions around relative risk. The more beneficial that you think e-cigarettes are, you also see a difference in the change. It's notable, however, that under either scenario, in the idealistic scenario, it's still a strong net benefit, just slightly lowered. Yet, in fact, the most powerful difference that we see has to do not with onset or even with relative risk, but the effect on smoking cessation in the population generally. So there are a couple of places, there's a large number of places where smoking cessation is sort of built into this model in the transition rates. But one important one is sort of the general effect of the presence of e-cigarettes on quitting smoking. Does having e-cigarettes in the population in general engender quitting? And sort of the data that we have suggests that it does, that there has been sort of as been noted, as e-cigarettes have, or at least traditionally, as e-cigarettes have increased, we see a lowering of smoking, and the estimates from looking at that data suggest it's around a difference, a rate of about 1.14. If we could double that, if we could wave our magic wand, what we would see would be a tremendous change, so that instead of our negative impact of e-cigarettes in our main scenario, we could see over 4.5 million life years gained. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that I don't have a magic wand and I don't know of any in particular. But this I think demonstrates that where there's tremendous power to make a difference is in increasing the ability of e-cigarettes to affect smoking cessation directly, can have an incredible magnitude of an effect. To talk, though, about a more realistic scenario other than magic wands, we're looking into another of other sort of policy scenarios that may try and simulate this increase in smoking cessation. We're working with Nick Wilson and his team are leading a project that is looking at developing more rigorous effect estimates using systematic reviews and expert panels. But here's more of a thought experiment to think through the possibilities of what we can do with simulation models. So the idea here is limiting sales of e-cigarettes to pharmacies only. And there are a number of potential advantages to that situations. One, we know that rates and absolute rates of quitting in clinical environments and within in studies and with the assistance are double that we see in the population and by people working on their own. We also know that e-cigarettes can be challenging to learn, and many sort of vape shops, for instance, are dedicated to that process of teaching people which products will work best for them, understanding sort of changes and needs and titrations needed by any particular individual. That also could be provided within some sort of clinical environment. And on the other hand, that restricting access to pharmacies or perhaps other venues also limits access. So, and particularly limits access to those who are seeking out vaping as a recreational product, that limiting access in particular to those who, in the parlance of previously, those who would have been non-smokers. It makes it less appealing if you have to go speak to your pharmacist to access vaping products. And this might, I think in this scenario, we're not thinking about prescription models necessarily, but just under the guidance of a more clinical situation. Now, of course, reducing access reduces access across the board, including among those who would benefit from increased access to vaping products, those people who are trying to quit smoking using them. So if we think through what would be the translate that scenario to parameters in the model. And this is what, again, that Nick Wilson's team is looking to build more rigorous ones. But that if we think through it, we can see that maybe that this would lead us more to believe that that the population smoking cessation rate could increase. That seeing e-cigarettes as a cessation device rather than a recreational device may lead more people to consider smoking, perhaps even those who don't actually use e-cigarettes themselves. That process of changing may impact it itself. And as we've seen, that we do get a doubling of quit rates within more clinical settings and with assistance. We also would expect that limiting access would lower the rates of vaping onset in general, lower the onset of dual use, that people would use them more for quitting rather than for sort of recreational dual use. And I think importantly, change the age gradient of onset, that youth in particular are generally less likely to want to access the health system, but older people are more, unfortunately, as a process of aging, more used to accessing the health system and maybe more eager to access something that is smoking, it's cessation related. I think it's notable in the current Canadian context that we really haven't done a very good job at reaching people of older ages who may be interested in smoking cessation using vaping, that we've done a tremendously good job at advertising to youth. But there's been very little increase under this, our current rates of current legalization processes of actually attracting the older smokers. So putting together all of these parameters, what we find out is that, again, compared to our main scenario, that this pharmacies only model would, given these particular set of assumptions, which I think are very arguable, would provide a net benefit of $1.2 million, 1.2 million quality adjusted life years compared to our current main scenario. And again, this is under the 33% risk rate. The advantage of a major change like this is also that it is more robust to changes in estimates of the relative risks themselves. That if we did, our relative risks of e-cigarettes did turn out to be higher than we would expect, then it would still perhaps would still be able to have an overall net benefit. So to note here then that overall, harm reduction is a policy, and it's not a product. That when we think about the debate around e-cigarettes themselves, we have to think about what policies are in place, what programs, what regulations, because those are what ultimately determine what the benefit or cost to a population are. There are certainly, as we've seen, that the nature of the product and the nature of the relative risks of that product matters tremendously. But we can, at many different levels of that risk, make that product something that is harmful overall or something that is beneficial overall. And understanding what those policies are and understanding how those policies work is crucial for being able to create benefit for the Canadian population. So in conclusion then, the simulation models offer a powerful way to test our assumptions around the health effects of something like e-cigarettes. And we've shown here that the debate on the public health benefit of vaping, it hinges fundamentally under current scenarios on the relative risks of harm. That we can affect vaping onset under our main risk scenario, and that is sufficient to produce a small net benefit, but still within the uncertainty levels. But that more substantial changes, like perhaps moving to a pharmacy model or other significant changes to our access and policy options, could have the potential of greater benefit that would be robust to different assumptions of and knowledge of the harms of the e-cigarette products themselves. So I'd just like to thank a few people here, including Tony Blake and Nick Wilson and the team, for their tremendous work in trying to get to teach us how to use this. Rebecca Plouffe, who is a master's student who did much of the initial modeling. Nadia Flexner, Amanda Jones, who are using variants of this model for other purposes, and in particular helped us in the translation to the Canadian context, and acknowledgement funding from Health Canada SUEP program, which is led by Physicians for Smoke-Free Canada. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so very much, Michael and Anasua. One thing that I think we can say for certain is that this is not simple at all. And there are a lot of assumptions, a lot of data, a lot of room for error, and yet the modeling is tremendously powerful in pointing out some things that we need to think about and what their impacts may be. So Michael and Anasua, I've been monitoring the chat, and we don't have a lot of time, only about 8 minutes left in this session. So I'm going to pose some of the questions that came up in the chat, but probably not all of them. Some of them are more questions of clarification. So somebody asked, when you presented the data on how the Wilson team came to a relative risk of 33%. Within that, I think it was 47% relative risk related to cancer. One of the participants thought that was very high in comparison with other evidence that they had. Can you speak to that?
Yes, I mean, they conducted a systematic review looking at relative toxicant levels, and I agree. I think this is not the final number, and so they looked again only at the relative constituent numbers overall, particularly the ones that are thought to cause cancer, and that. I mean, I think these numbers will change, and that again, they may be low, and I would suspect that more likely it'll be more varied, that some cancers I think will be higher than this and some cancers will be lower. And so this gives an across the board estimates. And I think for us is the thing that we could most confidently speak to that has come up in a rigorous way the estimates from Public Health England, for instance, are not based on a systematic review. They were sort of a best guess at the time, and this came up a number of years ago before there were many different studies. But I think ultimately this is an uncertain number, and from a precautionary principle, we need to be able to deal with that uncertainty. Again, it may be low and it may be high, but we sort of need to make sure that our policies are robust to both possibilities.
Right. One participant noted that the David Levy's model doesn't account for dual use. Is that, do you have any comment on that?
I don't know the details for in depth of the dual use. It works differently, and so they do primarily look at switching rather than a dual use. I think that one of the one of the challenges there is that we don't know the impact of health of dual use, and so I think their assumption was that there was no that essentially built into that there's no benefit to dual use. So this is actually one way where their model is actually showing that it goes in the different direction of our overall results, but that is ultimately, I think, is their assumption there.
Okay. There are a couple of questions about transition probabilities. So one participant is asking, did you take into account, or what proportion of vapors did you assume then become smokers, for example? And I'll just add to that on the other side, the proportion of smokers who try to quit, are those proportions that go into your model, like those who succeed versus not succeed, and those are different in different jurisdictions because of the context? So did you use Canadian estimates for that and do sensitivity analyses around them?
Our main scenario does use the direct model from the previous model, but we did look at there are a number of places where there are parameters there, both within the actual transition probability. That was just from the non-smoker perspective. There's also it includes some transitions to quitting, to dual use, and there are some people who come in as smokers initially into the population, where there are different parameters around smoking cessation and dual use for them. So we did look at that, or that is something that we're looking, and the main impact is on that the main power here is actually on the population rate. That's the parameter that where changing it has the biggest effect. That the overall impact of e-cigarettes on the population cessation rate, which is relatively low to begin with. Our rate of cessation given for dual use is actually quite high. I would say it's about 2.5 times as likely is our base model assumption for dual use quitting.
Okay. And I think, part of the point here is that all of these parameters can be played with, which is the beauty of modeling, is that you put out some parameters and then you question them, and you can play with them. And as you've done and demonstrated in a very nice way. There's another question that I'm going to, it's a very long comment, but I'm going to turn it into a question, which is in the harms that you take into account. You talked about cancer and respiratory effects and cardiovascular effects. What about addiction in of itself, dependence? How do you deal with that?
That's a very good question. We don't have it directly in the model at all, and so it's not included as a cost. This is other physical elements. I mean, I would suspect that there are other physical diseases that would also eventually show up as well, perhaps from e-cigarettes and from smoking. I think that we can as a more controversial example, breast cancer is not included here, for instance, that I would include obesity as a potential cost. I mean, certainly, and I would like to see the impact of, we don't have of the relationship of mental health in general, where where we do see that quitting has quitting smoking anyways has really consistent advantages on improving mental health, and so that benefit is not included in the model either.
Right. So lots more that could be put in. It seems as much as it's in there, and as much I know how much work went into this. There's much more that could potentially still be done. There were a couple of questions also about the effects of information campaigns on reducing initiation of vaping and perhaps on improving quit rates of smokers who vape. And then also there's a comment about what do we know about restricting tobacco to pharmacies? And then, of course, that whole debate about where tobacco should be sold and relative to where e-cigarettes should be sold. But you can't answer any of those questions, I'm afraid, because we are out of time. So I'd like to thank all of the participants. I know that Michael and Anasua will be very happy to answer more questions. We are recording this. We'll take a snapshot of the chat. We'll save the chat as well. And please feel free to be in touch with any of us with any comments or questions about this. This work is continuing, and we will continue to inform you as it goes on. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Anasua, and thanks to all the participants. Thanks to Sonia for tremendous coordination as always. Bye-bye.
Thanks.